From the very beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Russian army has faced serious problems in logistics and combat management. Fierce Ukrainian resistance, highly effective guerrilla operations, and support from Western countries have led to significant losses among Russian troops. The Russian tactic of advancing with large columns of troops used in early stages led to the Russian army suffering significant losses in both manpower and equipment. The shortage of human resources have become one of the key problems for Russia on the Ukrainian front. The mobilization carried out in 2022 and 2023 led to an increase in the number of troops, but the level of combat training for new recruits was extremely low. This further weakened Russia's position in protracted war. The inability to replace the losses with quality troops, as well as the pressure from the international community, pushed the Kremlin to look for new sources of manpower and weapons. North Korea's intervention as a supplier of troops and ammunition was an important strategic step for Russia. However, it also increased global fears that the Russian-Ukrainian conflict is entering a new phase, drawing in not only European countries but also Asian powers. North Korea's intervention has sent a strong signal that this regional conflict is escalating into a global crisis. North Korea has begun supplying weapons and troops to the Russian army, which is trying to compensate for the significant losses in human and material resources, and North Korea has sent more than 13,000 sea containers to Russia since mid-2022. Intelligence reported that in October, Russian Navy ships delivered about 1,500 North Korean special forces to Russia, and a total of 12,000 soldiers are planned to be sent to help Russia. The United States and its NATO allies have warned that sending North Korean soldiers to the front in Ukraine would mean a significant escalation of the conflict between Moscow and the West. This video shows the arrival of the North Korean soldiers at a military base. It appears to be military unit 44980 of the 127th Motorized Rifle Division in the village of Sergeyevka in Russia's Primorsky Krai. In this video you can see North Korean soldiers receiving Russian military uniforms, and in this video you can see North Korean soldiers filmed at a training range in Sergeyevka, Primorsky Krai in Russia. NATO's General Secretary Mark Rutte and a delegation from the Republic of Korea, a close NATO partner, briefed the North Atlantic Council and the Indo-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan and New Zealand, on North Korea's growing involvement in Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. Meanwhile, South Korean officials have expressed concern about the prospect of North Korean soldiers gaining combat experience. The South Korean government has called the developments a serious security threat and warned that it could respond with additional measures, such as providing weapons to Ukraine. Deputy Commander of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, Maxim Zhorin, said that North Korean specialists have long cooperated with Russia in the military sphere, in particular air defense and engineering. So the presence of DPRK soldiers in the war against Ukraine is not new. According to him, the combat qualities of the soldiers may not be at the highest level, but their participation can still have a significant impact on the front. Meanwhile, North Korea has rejected accusations from South Korea and Ukraine that it is sending soldiers to fight on Russia's side in the war against Ukraine, claiming that its relations with Moscow are legitimate and based on cooperation. And the corresponding information about the troops of the DPRK was called baseless rumors. However, it is impossible to hide the presence of North Korean troops. Although Russia is trying to pass them off as buryats by handing out Russian passports, there are already many controversial materials on the internet, as yet unconfirmed or open fakes from North Koreans at the front or in the ranks of the Russian army. Before the Koreans themselves, canned dog meat appeared on the front. The dog meat was liked by starving Russian soldiers, but before they translated what was written on the can. However, at the recent BRICS summit, Putin himself threw a brick in his statements when he said that the presence of North Koreans was Russia's business. I quote, "It was not Russia's actions that led to the escalation." Putin also said, and once again spoke about the coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014. He also accused Western countries of arming the Ukrainian army and helping it fight. Putin recalled that earlier on Thursday, the State Duma ratified the Treaty of Comprehensive Strategic Partnership with North Korea, signed by the Russian president in Pyongyang this summer. The treaty implies mutual assistance in the event of aggression against one of its participants. There is Article 4, Putin said, and he added, "Pyongyang takes our agreement seriously." Article 4 of the agreement stipulated that if one of the partners finds itself in a state of war due to the armed attack by one or more states, the other party will immediately provide it with military assistance by all means at its disposal in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter and the laws of the DPRK and the Russian Federation. It's very similar to NATO's Article 5. What and how we will do within the framework of this article is our business. End of quote. Well, in that case, NATO's response should be our business, without regard to Putin's red lines, which are actually brown and have a characteristic smell. The response of the North Korea's intervention in the conflict was the strengthening of support for Ukraine by South Korea. For Seoul, this was an important signal about the need for active action. Since North Korea, which had threatened South Korea's security for decades, had now become part of the global crisis, South Korea, which has traditionally maintained a cautious position in international conflicts, was forced to reconsider its foreign policy strategy. South Korea's decision to join the conflict could significantly change the balance of power. South Korea has not only high-tech weapons, but also trained military specialists who can provide advisory support to Ukraine in the fight against North Korean troops. The South Koreans are well aware of the specifics of the actions of North Korean troops. For example, their strategy, methods of warfare, and the psychological state of soldiers who are under constant threat of reprisals. South Korea is one of the fastest growing arms producers in the world. So far, they have refrained from sending lethal weapons to Kyiv, providing only gas masks, first aid kits, etc. However, South Korea has sold weapons to countries like the United States and Poland, which supply the Ukrainian army. South and North Korea have very different approaches to weapons, reflecting their political and economic systems, as well as their strategic goals. South Korea is actively developing its defense industry and produces a variety of weapons. South Korean designs are often created in cooperation with foreign partners like the United States or based on their technology. Here are some key weapon systems that South Korea produces that could be used in Ukraine. The K-1 and the K-2 Black Panther tanks, one of the most advanced in the world and based on the Abrams tank. The K-21 infantry fighting vehicle, the K-808 and the K-806 armored personnel carriers, the K-9 Thunder 155mm self-propelled artillery system, which also Estonia, my country, wields. K-9 has been exported to various countries already. The Hyunmo-2 medium-range ballistic missile, the Hyunmo-3 long-range cruise missile, and the K-239 Chunmo multiple-launch rocket system. The K-SAM Chunma short-range air defense missile system, and the K-30 Biho mobile close-range air defense system. South Korea is also actively developing unmanned aerial vehicles, both for recon and combat, and has a very strong air force with modern aircraft such as the F-16. North Korea has a significant military with an emphasis on artillery, missile systems, and nuclear weapons. Although their equipment is often outdated by world standards, the country is actively developing missile and nuclear technology. Its technology is largely based on Soviet designs. The Hwasong-14 and Hwasong-15 intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Hwasong-12 intermediate-range ballistic missile, and the Bukguk-song submarine-launched ballistic missiles. On October 31st, North Korea conducted another missile test, causing another wave of indignation in the West. But such waves usually subside quickly. North Korea has a large amount of artillery, including long-barreled guns as M1978 Goksan, a long-range artillery piece, 170mm gun mounted in an open turret on the chassis of a T-54, T-62 or Type 59 tank. The KPA journal speculated that the gun may have developed based on the designs of the German 17cm guns, which may have been transferred in the 1960s by the Soviet Union. North Korea's main battle tank is the T-62, assembled under the license from the USSR. Also, North Korea has multiple rocket launchers, Chonma 215 and Chonma 216, North Korean tanks based on the T-62 and T-72 tanks, but with improvements. North Korea mainly uses older Soviet models of armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, but with some modifications. The KN-06 medium-range anti-aircraft missile system, similar to the Russian S-400. The Hwasong-9 cruise missile has already been deployed to shell Ukraine since November last year. Medium-range ballistic missile, an extended-range version of the North Korea's Hwasong-6. The Hwasong-9 has a demonstrated max range of around 1,000 kilometers. North Korea also has drones, but their technology lags behind the global standards. These missiles are based on the USSR, and Russian missiles like the R-11 and the R-17 are called in the West as Scud missiles. Iran also uses similar missiles. In exchange for sending troops and weapons, Pyongyang asked Moscow for technology for tactical nuclear weapons. According to Kirill Budanov, head of the main intelligence directorate or GUR of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, North Korea does not donate its people or weapons to Russia for charitable purposes. The expanded cooperation is the result of a mutual assistance treaty signed by Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang in June 2024. Budanov describes the secret provisions of the deal as Russian money and know-how in exchange for Korean people and missiles. Russia is helping North Korea circumvent sanctions and strengthen its nuclear potential. According to Budanov, the Russian Federation is transferring some technologies for low-yield tactical nuclear weapons and underwater missile launch systems to the DPRK. As reported, North Korea has also sent pilots to the Russian Federation who can fly Russian military aircraft. This is reported by Newsweek. On this footage you can see a pilot posing with a Russian Su-25 ground attack aircraft during the second day of the Wonsan Friendship Air Festival in North Korea on September 25th, 2016. They were sent not long before information appeared about the deployment of DPRK ground forces on October 8th. According to Newsweek, such redeployment of pilots may be associated with training on Russian combat aircraft supplied to North Korea. But it is possible that Russia, which has a shortage of pilots, has turned to North Korea for help. If confirmed, Russia would be the first overseas deployment of North Korean combat pilots since the Vietnam War. They also operated in Syria and Egypt during the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Glavcom reported that North Korea sent an elite unit of so-called combat slaves to fight in Ukraine. According to South Korean intelligence, they were given fake documents and Russian passports and disguised as Buryats and Yakuts. Therefore, the photograph of dead North Korean with the passport raises doubts that it is a fake. On October 5th, North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un visited a special unit in Western Command of the Korean People's Army, which is considered one of the most brutal in the world. These soldiers, combat slaves, grew up in an information vacuum without any outside influence. They were raised from infancy to hate everything connected with the United States and the outside world in general. An army made up entirely of Sergeant Todds. Lee Song-kwen, a lawmaker on the South Korean committee, said that Pyongyang authorities had tried to keep news of the deployment from spreading. I quote, "There are also signs of North Korean authorities relocating and insulating those families of the troops in certain places in order to effectively control them and thoroughly crack down on the rumors." End of quote. Lee also said that the agency confirmed that Russia had recruited a large number of interpreters for the North Korean soldiers while training them in the use of military equipment such as drones. I quote, "Russian instructors are assessing that North Korean military has excellent physical attributes and moral, but lacks understanding of modern warfare such as drone attacks." End of quote. He continues, "Therefore, there could be many casualties if they are deployed to the front lines. However, the language barrier is not a big problem for Russia and its war tactics. These soldiers are needed for assaults and it is a one-way ticket. They only need to know one or two words like forward or shoot, and they are ready to fight. It is unlikely that Russia has complex tactical maneuvers of North Korean group in the plans." The South Korean presidential office urged an immediate withdrawal of the North Korean troops from Russia, warning that it may consider supplying lethal weapons to Ukraine if military ties between them went too far. United States officials say that Russia has suffered more than 700,000 killed or wounded troops in the war in Ukraine. Lloyd Austin said that the alleged North Korean deployment could point out a shortage of Russian recruits. I quote, "This is an indication that the Russian President Vladimir Putin may be in even more trouble than most people realize." End of quote. Russia responded to South Korea's plans to support Ukraine in its own style, traditionally blaming the West for everything. South Korea has begun to get involved in the Washington's adventures in supplying Western weapons to Ukraine. This statement was made by Russia's Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN, Anna Yestignyeva. "We call on our South Korean colleagues to come to their senses and not to take this extremely dangerous path, which will not lead to anything good for Seoul." End of quote. She also believes that Russia's actions are aimed at de-escalation. The Russian-Korean Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership reduces the risk of escalation on the Korean Peninsula, including with the use of nuclear weapons. End of quote again. She believes Russia is de-escalating tensions by helping North Korea. Funny. I'll continue with her quote. "The Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership between our two countries, concluded on June 19th, is intended to play a stabilizing role in the region based on the principle of indivisibility of security, to reduce the risk of relapse of war on the peninsula, including with the use of nuclear weapons." End of quote. The United Nations has become a club for autocrats who come together to play the victim and blame everything on the Western powers. This applies to the war in Ukraine as well as the conflict in Israel. Against the backdrop of Russia's growing isolation, Korea has become a new popular tourist destination. The DPRK offers its guests a rich program. Russians bring back rare footage from Korea. Russians travel to the main attractions of the country, following a route carefully planned by propagandists and secret services. These services are not really that secret because everyone who surrounds the guests from the neighboring country works for the Department of State Security of the DPRK. The program includes visiting statues of the Kims, baking traditional bread, night songs with guitar in nature, because the carefully selected agent, who apparently also works as a tourist guide, knows Russian ballads and the Russian anthem. All this takes place against the backdrop of empty streets, subways and buildings. Hospitable North Koreans make sure that nothing nasty disturbs the eyes of the vacationers. A fake facade, behind which lies the real horror, poverty and brutal cruelty of the Kim regime. The dictatorship of the Kim family in Korea was established in 1945 after the end of the war with Japan. At the time, the regime was supported by China and the USSR. This is a long-standing friendship In 1940, a representative of the Soviet Far Eastern Front sent letters to the commanders of the anti-Japanese units fighting in Manchuria, inviting them to a meeting in Khabarovsk that was being prepared by Comintern. As a result of the Khabarovsk meeting, the Manchurian partisan base was deployed in the USSR, the North Korean camp near Khabarovsk and the southern camp, also known as Camp B, where Kim Il-sung's fighters were stationed. After the end of the World War II, by decision of the Potsdam Conference, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel into Soviet and American occupation zones, and Kim came to the power in North with the support of China and the USSR. For several generations, North Korea has lived in complete isolation and under the most severe repression, where any careless word can end in a death sentence and exile to a camp for 3 generations of a family. Against this backdrop, Russians are having fun and rejoicing. Summer camps for Russians were held in the DPRK, and the old friendship between these two countries is being passed on to future generations. Supplies from Russia and Iran, rising tensions between the two Koreas, and the involvement in the conflict on the side of opposing camps are increasing the risk of further escalation in the East Asian region. In the context of global instability and active meddling by Russia's Asian allies in European affairs, South Korea is forced to take decisive measures to prevent its northern neighbor from gaining influence. Also, North Korean soldiers will have real combat experience, although questionable, which could give them an unexpected advantage in using modern tactics and technology that Russia can share. Director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin, Alexander Gabuyev, said that while the West's support for Ukraine is driven by strategic defense interests and Western values as defined by NATO, Moscow's alliance with North Korea and Iran should be seen largely as deals. Quote, "They are well paid, they can test their equipment, they can gain combat experience." End of quote. But that doesn't matter, the relationship isn't strong, he stressed. I quote, "Even if it's essentially a deal, the West can't offer a deal right now that would tempt them to betray their partners." End of quote. For North Korea, fighting a war against Ukraine could be seen as an attempt to strengthen its position on the world stage. Geopolitically, North Korea's intervention could be another step towards expanding the global conflict. The entry of new players into the war increases the likelihood that other countries, especially China and the United States, will be drawn into the conflict indirectly or directly. This creates a risk of the war expanding beyond Ukraine and Russia, which would have even more serious consequences for the international security. Any training the North Korean soldiers do in North Korea will not replace real combat experience, which is far more superior. And this combat experience from Ukraine could be useful in the event of a potential conflict in the Korean peninsula. Fyodor Dertitsky, a North Korean specialist at Kookmin University in Seoul, said North Korea has previously sent soldiers abroad as technicians trained as fighter pilots in the Egyptian Air Force. But he added that sending thousands of troops to Russia poses a risk to the Kim regime. On the front lines, North Korean soldiers might surrender or flee. But even more dangerous for the Kim regime would be the prospect of ideological contamination. Most of them have never been abroad and have lived their entire lives in North Korea's tightly controlled information bubble. Kim will have a hard time motivating his people to fight in a distant country without knowing why they are fighting. End of quote. In the case of North Korea, the pattern of Russian cooperation with Iran, which has sent missiles and attack drones for military purposes, appears to be repeating itself. Relations between Russia and Iran have varied under Putin, but the war has strengthened ties. And of course, such cooperation helps sow instability strategically. I quote, "It is in Putin's interest to increase tensions on the Korean peninsula, as well as in the Middle East, because it means yet another additional conflict for the West, and even less attention, energy and money for Ukraine, which is their strategic goal." This is said by a senior European intelligence official. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian traveled to Russia for summit of the BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. He is also planning a separate visit to Moscow to sign what the parties have called the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement. I quote, "This agreement is very important because it should lay the foundation for further development of relations between Russia and Iran." This is said by Yuri Lyamin. Russia has already established relationships with Iran-linked militants in the Middle East. United States intelligence agencies have warned that Russia could send sophisticated anti-ship cruise missiles to Yemen's Houthis in retaliation for the Biden administration's support for Ukrainian airstrikes on Russia using United States weapons. Such a move would increase the threat of United States warships in the Middle East, where the Houthis have attacked cargo ships in solidarity with the Palestinians in the Gaza conflict. Moscow's provision of anti-ship missiles to the Houthis is another of the escalation concerns that the United States has cited in limiting Ukraine's use of its weapons against Russia. Russia also has an old relationship with Iran. After the establishment of Soviet power in 1920 in Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan, an even greater number of White Guards moved to the Persian territory. Then Soviet troops carried out a naval operation, recapturing the former White Fleet in the port of Enzelim. In the north of Persia, the Gilan Soviet Socialist Republic was formed, and the real danger of the establishment of Soviet power in Iran arose. Under these conditions, the Persian authorities became more accommodating and went to an agreement with the Soviet Russia. The Soviet-Iranian Friendship Treaty of 1921 transferred a number of assets to Iran. In 1927, Treaty of Guarantee and Neutrality obliged both countries not to participate in agreements against each other's security. The Islamic Revolution in Iran was greeted favorably by the USSR authorities. The Soviet ambassador was the first to be received by the new Iranian leader Ayatollah Khomeini after the victory of the revolution. President Ebrahim Raisi, like Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian, who died with him in a helicopter crash in May 2024, were rightfully considered consistent supporters of Russia. The Russian direction was a priority from the very beginning of Raisi's presidency. It was to Moscow in January 2022 that he made one of his first foreign visits after being elected president. However, that trip was not accompanied by any breakthrough agreements. It was remembered only for the fact that the Iranian leader performed namaz in the Kremlin. Nevertheless, it was during Raisi's presidency that historic breakthroughs in relations between Moscow and Tehran occurred. His team included an agreement of Gazprom's $40 billion investment in the Iranian oil and gas sector, an agreement on the construction of a Rashta-Stara railway by Russian force to complete the north-south transport corridor from Russia to Persian Gulf, an agreement to create a full-fledged free trade zone between Iran and the Eurasian Economic Union. Finally, the main innovation was military cooperation with Tehran's dramatically changed status for Moscow. The Iranian military-industrial complex began exporting weapons to Russia for the first time, and Iranian instructors began teaching Russians how to best wage a modern war. In exchange, Iran has already received combat training aircraft from Russia, to which 24 Su-35 fighters may soon be added. However, this was not so much about President Raisi's special Russophilia, but rather about the beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was followed by Moscow's isolation in the West. It was the circumstances that made the path of Russian-Iranian rapprochement so stable. That is, the general trend towards deepening cooperation arose due to the new geopolitical realities, and they remain unchanged for now, regardless of who is the new president of Iran. The recent BRICS summit in Kazan was attended by the new president of Iran, where he met with Putin and discussed the strategic cooperation between Russia and Iran. He also met with Lukashenko, the potato head. With the start of Russian invasion, NATO countries have sharply increased their military budgets and began rearming. The conflict of Ukraine has also brought some countries that had previously taken a neutral position closer together. Finland and Sweden, fearing possible aggression from Russia, applied to join NATO, which has changed the balance of power in Northern Europe. The conflict has prompted a reassessment of the strategic priorities of many countries. China, which has long been neutral regarding the war, has gradually taken a more pro-Russian position, seeing it as an opportunity to strengthen its influence in the international arena and create an alternative to the Western world's order. India, one of the world's largest economies, has also remained neutral, trying to balance between the West and Russia in order to maintain favorable economic relations with both sides. Global dictatorships, seeing the West's indecisiveness in the Ukraine conflict, have begun to join forces, and a new axis of evil has formed. Russia, China, North Korea and Iran. And each of these countries now poses a threat in its own region. In recent years, China has increasingly carried out military exercises near Taiwan. Taiwan calls them a provocation. Beijing launched another large-scale military exercise around Taiwan and its islands in September 2024, calling them a warning. The maneuvers, which China's Eastern Theater Command said, involved joint exercises by its army, navy, air force and missile units. It took place around Taiwan and the Taiwanese Strait. China's claims to Taiwan have been persistent and could become the next flashpoint, along with the conflict of the Korean Peninsula. Dictatorships have begun to attack the world of democracy, and this did not happen in one day. After the destruction of the Soviet Union, it seemed to everyone that the global confrontation between the two systems was a thing of the past. Russia moved towards rapprochement with the West. World markets were open to the China. Even in Iran, there were voices about rapprochement with the West, and there was some relaxation in sanctions, but there were still 10 to 15 years left before sanctions were imposed due to its nuclear program in 2006. Israel signed a peace agreement with Palestine in 1993, and in the 2000s, Ariel Sharon sought to align with the Muslim countries around him. In 2000, the president of South Korea visited North Korea for the first time. It seemed to everyone that there was a warming of relations between dictatorial regimes and democratic world. It seemed then that if we ensured their participation in the world trade and access to open market, they in turn would abandon wars in favor of the benefits of free trade. Everyone expected that economic success would be followed by democratization. Nobel Peace Prizes were handed out left and right, but this all turned out to be a fatal mistake. Dictatorships have not abandoned the idea of establishing a world order not based on law and justice. They want distribution into zones of influence according to the right of the stronger. Participation in foreign markets enriched dictatorships enormously, and they had opportunities that they never had before. And now they went on the offensive against democracy. Large dictatorships began to sponsor their satellites. For example, Russia supports Belarus, China supports Venezuela, Iran supports Palestine, not to mention dozens of African countries. And the more funds there were in Russia and China, the more their rhetoric became aggressive. And for 20 years, these countries have been building networks in Europe and the United States, buying the necessary politicians, media and social networks. The information front has become one of the main ones through which they seek to undermine the trust in democracy. It's not for nothing that the far-right or far-left politicians became popular around the world since late 2010s. They were also supported by Russia or China, while simultaneously investing billions in information campaigns on social networks. TikTok is the direct culprit for the fact that support for communism and leftist ideas have become so popular among young people. Support for Palestine too. Social network algorithms that select news according to the preference leave people in an information bubble. Facebook groups have become Russia's main weapon for organizing protests across Europe. The anti-Israel narrative is spreading by Palestine, and the world's leading media outlets rely on their statements to further spread the lies. Hamas has complete control over the information flow from Gaza, and we have come to a point where the countries of the world rely on the data of a terrorist. The United Nations has become a platform for legitimizing dictators and terrorists. Palestine received expanded rights, and Taiwan, expelled from the UN in 1971, was named as a province of China. The ICC indicated Netanyahu, shifting responsibility for the actions of Hamas to the leader of a democratic country. He was equated with terrorists and accused of genocide. Let me remind you that Israel is in 30th place on Democratic Index, right behind Estonia at 27. And the United States at 29. Nevertheless, Hamas figures are more credible than Israel's statements. Anti-Semitism is running wild on social networks. The Twitter platform, which Elon Musk bought with the support of dictators from Saudi Arabia, immediately turned into a platform for the most radical ideas, and he himself calls not to trust conventional media, becoming another mouthpiece in the hands of dictatorships to undermine the trust in democracies. Why did dictatorships go on the offensive? For self-preservation. Dictatorships do not have the support of their people, and democratization is a threat to them. Arab Spring followed the Gaddafi protest and war in Syria, protest in Iran, protests in China due to COVID restrictions. The first and only reason for the war in Ukraine is the course of Ukraine towards democratization and rapprochement with Europe. Putin was afraid of the revolution in his country. Georgia in 2008 is the same. Saakashvili carried out reforms and wanted rapprochement with the EU. Now another dictatorship is forming there, and if it's not stopped now, it will be more difficult later. A democratic world order gives an advantage to the countries based on law and justice. The quality of life of the people is always higher in a democracy, and the country's economy is stronger. And this is a threat to dictatorships, because their population usually wants this too. The sentiments are suppressed by force and repression. Dictatorships want to divide the world into zones of influence according to the right of the stronger, as was the case for the 19th century. And so far, democracy is retreating, trying to appease dictators and afraid to fight back. The nuclear arsenal will remain a deterrent against global war, but conflicts such as in Georgia, Ukraine, Israel, and quite likely soon in Taiwan or Korea will occur in different places. The only right decision is a strong rebuff. My friends, this has been my analysis of the axes of evil: China, Russia, North Korea, and their support to Russia, who is actively fighting their aggressive war in Ukraine. If you like this analysis, please subscribe to the channel and become a Buy Me a Coffee monthly member, monthly supporter of the channel. The link is in the description below to ensure that I can make more analysis like these for you in the future. Also, I do Ukrainian updates Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Until my next video, Ukrainian update or an in-depth analysis of a certain topic, Slava Ukraini, and bye-bye.